All right, I think we are ready to reconvene. Boy, is this a rowdy group. Just a reminder, if you're glancing at your schedule, this is the second part of our afternoon. We have another presentation. Actually, we have three more presentations. We have a research presentation and then a boots on the field presentation from various other people I'll be introducing. I did want to remind you that after the next talks, we will have a panel discussion followed by a reception. Our reception will probably start around 5 downstairs. We do have food and complimentary wine bar. And if you all run out without eating, then we have too much food left over. So please plan on staying at least for a little bit. So I am very excited to introduce to you Dr. William Gormley. I think you go by Bill. Do you go by Bill? He's a professor in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, so he's visiting us from Washington, D.C. His work on early childhood has spanned several decades, and I was looking at a paper that you wrote about 2 decades ago, really pushing from a policy perspective the idea that early childhood programming is not just a private issue, it's a public policy issue as well. So you've been very influential for some time in pushing early childhood education into the public policy agenda. If you're a researcher in the room, what I'm about to tell you ought to impress you greatly. In 2008, he was the lead author of a paper in Science. Most people don't ever publish anything in Science, so it's pretty exciting if your work is published in Science. And that paper was titled Preschool Programs Can Boost School Readiness. And I think you might have a copy of that paper in your packet, so you can read that later. And we asked Dr. Gormley to be with us today because he has been heavily involved with the evaluation of the Tulsa preschool program. And so he's here to offer expert findings regarding a long-standing preschool program and what they have found as they've continued to monitor it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gormley.
Thanks, Laura. I'm holding this and see if it works. How's that in the back? Is that too loud? Is that better? Okay. Well, I am actually very happy to be here in Columbus for at least 2 reasons. The first is that when I was in high school growing up in Pittsburgh, my class play was something called a Thurber Carnival. I don't know if that rings a bell with any of you. But my role in that play was not the male lead, as it turns out, but it was a different role, and that was to recite a monologue that began like this. I suppose the high water mark of my youth in Columbus, Ohio, was the night the bed fell on my father. It happened then that my father decided to sleep in the attic one night so that he could get away to think. My mother strongly opposed this idea because she said the old wooden bed up there was totally unreliable. If you like, I can keep reciting it and skip my remarks. But I do have a special affection for Columbus, in part because of James Thurber, who I believe grew up either on South High Street or near South High Street or somewhere near there. The second reason I'm very happy to be here is because Columbus is the home of Jenny's Ice Cream. And so it's an honor and a privilege to me to be within sniffing distance of your world-famous ice cream here. So I'm going to march through my PowerPoint, but before I do that, let me just say something about Dale's extremely insightful remarks before I proceed. When an iceberg melts, you have to put the water in buckets. And I'd like, as you listen to me and you compare what I say to what Dale just said, I'd like for you to think of 3 buckets. So the first bucket would be Dale's discussion of her Tennessee research that she and Mark Lipsey have done and its findings and implications. That's bucket number 1. The second bucket is her review of the existing literature and her critique or implicit critique of that literature. That would be bucket number 2. And the third is her vision for the future, which is bucket number 3. And the point I'd like to make about all these buckets is that you can agree with Dale on some buckets, but not all buckets. That I would encourage you to disentangle those different buckets and think separately about them. Then the only other thing I would say is that I will try to leave some time for questions, so I'll go through my presentation a little more quickly, and that'll leave some time for questions, so feel free. In my department, I don't know how it is in psychology departments, in public policy departments, it's sort of like oral arguments at the Supreme Court. We're accustomed to being interrupted all the time. I'm not going to encourage you to do that, but you should feel free to ask questions. Okay. So let's see how the clicking is working. It looks pretty good. All right. So I'm mainly going to talk about our research in Tulsa, but I will also be trying to put that research in perspective. As you've heard, there's a lot of excellent brain research by neuroscientists that attest to the critical importance of the earliest years in a young child's life in determining that child's future success. And this is now increasingly understood. In fact, I think it's understood increasingly by parents. You can see parents shopping for the best cribmobile here, the one that generates the most synapses. And I think that attests to growing recognition by parents that what happens or doesn't happen in the earliest years of life is really enormously important. So there's a lot of research that's been done, not just on preschool, but on high-quality preschool. And it's important, before we get too deeply into the subject, to emphasize that whether you're talking about daycare centers or pre-K programs or other programs that serve young children, that quality really matters. And so there are different ways to measure quality. I was heartened to hear in conversations we had before the program began about some of the ways that quality is being measured in New York City's universal pre-K program. We need to make sure that whatever we do, the programs that serve our young children are really good programs. So the first question I'd like to address is an important one. Does high-quality pre-K boost school readiness? And I'm going to focus on Oklahoma, a state that I've been visiting regularly, almost obsessively, since 2001, which is when we began our research. We got interested in Oklahoma, not because of its Western mystique, although there is that, and its bluegrass music, although there is that, but because they established one of the earliest universal pre-K programs just after Georgia did. It was established in 1998. Unlike the Georgia program that Andy described so beautifully, this is a program that is not funded by a lottery or any other dedicated funding source. It's funded through the school aid formula as part of the general fund. And it's also a program, incidentally, that did not have a long gestation period. I thought Andy described rather nicely how the Georgia program unfolded very gradually and morphed quite a bit over time. The Oklahoma pre-K program exploded suddenly. And enrollments in this program, from the very, very beginning of the program, were dramatic. So the program caught fire very quickly. It was enormously popular with parents. And it's interesting that this is a very, very red state. This is a very conservative state. Nevertheless, from the very start, this universal pre-K program was incredibly popular with parents. And it's a program that puts a lot of emphasis, although not an exclusive emphasis, on public schools. So in Oklahoma, the public schools are the primary service delivery organizations. There are options for other providers to get involved, and as a practical matter, the other providers who do get involved in Oklahoma tend to be the Head Start programs. And so we have studied not only the school-based pre-K program in Tulsa, but we've also studied the Tulsa Head Start program, and I'm going to report on some of our findings before we finish today. Not all of them, because some of the findings are still work in progress. I should say, apropos quality, that in Oklahoma, every lead teacher must have a BA degree and must be early childhood certified. That's their way to try to promote quality. There are also very good child-staff ratio requirements as well. It's important to note that the pre-K teachers in Oklahoma's universal pre-K program are paid a regular public school wage. Even the Head Start program in Tulsa, which is not legally required to pay their teachers at the same wage rate, does. So the Tulsa Head Start program, like the Tulsa Public Schools program, pays its teachers a regular public school wage and regular public school benefits, which is great for recruitment and retention, both of which are important to quality. So our research has been going on forever, or so it seems, and we've been in the field on 3 separate occasions looking at the effects of the Tulsa early childhood education programs on school readiness. The first time was in the fall of 2001, then the fall of 2003, and the fall of 2006. And I'm going to report on the third of these because that's the one that has the best measures and because it's most recent. I'm not going to discuss our research design strategy for assessing the effects of early childhood education on school readiness, since I understand Andy did such a wonderful job of doing that on my behalf 2 years ago. But I would just say that we introduced a regression discontinuity design when we first undertook our research, and we believe it has some special strengths if your goal is to assess school readiness, because we think it does a credible job of addressing selection bias problems. That's what it looks like, but again, I'm not going to linger on that. So what kinds of tests did we have at our disposal? For the research that focused on kids entering kindergarten in the fall of 2006, we used 3 subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Test, and they were aimed at measuring children's pre-reading skills, their pre-writing skills, and also their pre-math skills. We administered those tests to as many children as possible, the overwhelming majority of children, in the fall of 2006. Actually, let me amend that. It was really in August 2006, and I amend that in order to emphasize that this was a true pretest. Sometimes when researchers are out in the field, they wind up administering the tests during the first week, the first month or so. This was literally a test that was administered before classes began, just because we were able to negotiate that with people on the ground in Tulsa. Let me mention briefly that we also had the teachers conduct social-emotional assessments of their children in the fall of 2006, so that became part of this particular study that we did. And this gives you a sense of what the sample sizes were for our research looking at the effects of Tulsa's early childhood education programs on school readiness. So, what did the students look like? At the time, about 2/3 of the students were eligible for either a free lunch or a reduced price lunch. So most of them were disadvantaged. At the time, 34% of the students were white, 33% were black, 21% were Hispanic, and 11% were Native American. We thought that that was very attractive to us as researchers because it meant we had a very diverse student body. So what can we say about what was going on inside Tulsa pre-K classrooms during the year before we conducted our testing? This gives you the results of some class observations that we conducted for all intents and purposes in every school-based pre-K classroom in Tulsa. And we were fortunate to be able to compare those class results with some data from friends at the University of North Carolina that had data from 11 other states. And those data also used class, and those data also included a lot of school-based pre-K programs. So we were able to compare the class scores in Tulsa with the class scores from students in school-based pre-K programs in 11 other states. And here you see the instructional support indicators, which find consistently that the quality of instructional support in Tulsa was superior to that which you found in other pre-K classrooms in other states. So that's one reason why we believe that the level of quality was relatively high in Tulsa. Here's another reason why we believe that. You heard Dale talk about how in some of the classrooms she has visited, in Tennessee, they're devoting very little attention to math, for example. In Tulsa, we found that the teachers were devoting a lot of attention to math, both in absolute terms and also in relative terms compared to what was going on in other states. Here too, we had the benefit of data from 11 other states, the same 11 states, and so we can say that in Tulsa's pre-K classrooms, the teachers were allocating substantial amounts of time to educational instruction and educational activities, as opposed to everything else. So that would be yet another indicator that the quality of the Tulsa Public Schools pre-K programs is relatively high. So, what did we find on the actual effects of the school-based pre-K program on children's school readiness? What we've done is to convert our estimates or coefficients and effect sizes into terms that hopefully everyone can understand. We've converted them into monthly gains so that we can compare the kids who are in the treatment group, that is, they received the school-based pre-K services, to comparable kids who did not. And we found that the Tulsa Public Schools pre-K program boosts pre-reading skills by 9 months. It boosts pre-writing skills by 7 months. And it boosts pre-math skills by 5 months. We also took a closer look to see if these gains are applicable to both disadvantaged students and middle class students. And we thought this was important because historically, so many of the programs that have been launched over the years have been targeted programs. So this was a rare opportunity for us, looking in depth at one of the first universal pre-K programs in America, to actually see whether the kids from different social strata are all benefiting. And the answer to that question is they are. So middle class kids benefit, disadvantaged kids benefit. The disadvantaged kids benefit a little more. And I don't think it's too difficult to construct a narrative for that, nor do I think that's a bad thing, on the contrary. But all the kids seem to be benefiting from participating in the program based on our findings in Tulsa. So let me just comment briefly on the Head Start program, known as the CAP Head Start program of Tulsa County. We did the same kind of analysis, looking at their effects on school readiness. And so just to make sure it's clear what we're doing, when we looked at effects on the school-based pre-K program, we compared kids who are in the school-based pre-K program with kids who are not in that program or in Head Start. And we're comparing kids who are in Head Start with kids who are not in either the school-based program or Head Start. So here too, when we look at Head Start, you're seeing that the Head Start kids are several months ahead of their peers in their pre-reading, pre-writing, and pre-math skills at the beginning of kindergarten. The gains are a little less impressive for the Head Start kids. Specifically, the gains are less impressive for their verbal skills, although the gains are equally impressive for math skills. And I should just say, I'm not going to show you this, but when we did the class comparisons and the time on task comparisons for the Tulsa Head Start program, as opposed to other Head Start programs in these same 11 states, we also found that they were relatively high in their quality, which is not too surprising when you consider that they have made it a point of honor to make sure that their teachers have a BA degree, that their teachers are early childhood certified, and that their teachers are paid a regular public school wage. So, just to sum up what I've said so far, we find that both the Tulsa Public Schools pre-K program and the CAP Head Start program improve school readiness. We find that disadvantaged students receive a bigger boost, but that all students benefit. And we find that both programs are high-quality programs. But do these short-term effects persist over time? That's a big question. It's a difficult question. And we have decided to tackle it as best we could over the past few years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our findings and try to put them in perspective. Before I do that, I want to emphasize at the outset that when we shift our focus from the effects of pre-K on school readiness to the question of whether or not short-term pre-K effects persist over time, we are looking at a complex phenomenon with outcomes that depend not only on what happens in the pre-K program, but also on what's happening in our public schools. Not to mention what's happening in our families, not to mention what's happening in our neighborhoods. So that's important when you look at the fade-out phenomenon. We believe the fade-out phenomenon is real. We believe it's something that social scientists should study and that policy analysts should worry about. But even if we find evidence of fade-out, I would hope that you would not be too hasty to judge the pre-K program as necessarily or automatically being responsible for the fade-out. It's sort of like, what was the Agatha Christie mystery, Murder on the Orient Express, where there were multiple multiple murderers, only one victim. So there are lots of possible explanations whenever you encounter fade out. And another word about fade out. Fade out is really fade out, how many of you have taken piano lessons over the course of a lifetime? Okay? How many of you would like to come up here if we had a piano and play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C sharp minor? So, fade out is a fact of life, and we shouldn't be glib about it. We should try to reduce it, and we should ask what its causes are. But we should also not be shocked when we see it. Okay. What did we find when we looked at third graders? Could we see any differences between the third graders in Tulsa who had been in the school-based pre-K program and the kids who had not? And here I should just say, I think I have a slide, we used a different technique. We couldn't use our regression discontinuity design, attached to it though we were. We used a technique which Dale referred to briefly in her own remarks, propensity score matching, where you try to match the students as well as you can in their demographic characteristics. And then there are statistics that tell you whether you've done a good job or not. And your ability to do a good job when you do propensity score matching depends in large measure on how rich your demographic and other variables are. Luckily, in the Tulsa case, we had access to a rich array of demographic variables because we had access not only to administrative data but to parent survey data that asked a lot of questions about, mother's education, is the biological father present at home, what were early child care experiences, and that sort of thing. And I noticed when Dale was mentioning her research in Tennessee that they also had some very rich covariates, and that's important when you're trying to maximize equivalency between two groups. So it doesn't eliminate selection bias questions, but we think if it's done well, that it can go a long way towards equalizing your treatment group and your control group. In looking at third grade outcomes, we were focusing just on two outcomes, on standardized language test scores, reading in particular, and standardized math test scores. So what this chart does is to show, using propensity score matching, what our early findings were. That's what you see on the left. That tells you what the findings were at kindergarten entry. And then what were the findings as of third grade using propensity score matching. What this tells you is that as of third grade, it was still possible to distinguish between the children who were in the school-based pre-K program and the children who were not, based on their math scores. So the kids who were in the school-based program in Tulsa were doing better on their standardized math test scores than comparable kids who were not. We did not find that to be the case with reading scores. So the math findings differed from the reading findings, and I'm happy to discuss that if there's time. More recently, we've decided it would be very useful, though painful, for us to try to do the same kind of analysis for kids who are now in seventh grade. At least they were in seventh grade when we gathered the data. They're now even older, as it turns out. And what we did here was something similar to propensity score matching, except it's actually propensity score weighting, which we think has some advantages, and that was the technique that we used. We also were able to look at a wider variety of outcomes. So we continued to focus on standardized math and reading test scores because we think they're important. but we also tried to look at some other outcomes that we had previously been unable to look at. So what I'm going to do in this next part, I don't think I'm going to. Let me just describe roughly how many of the kids we lost and what our remaining sample was. I'm not sure that that's all that helpful, especially for those of you in the back seats. So I'll put it in plain English. We wanted to retain in our sample as many of the original 4,000 kids who entered kindergarten in the fall of 2006 in Tulsa Public Schools as we could. So in addition to our agreement with the Tulsa Public Schools, we were able to sign data sharing agreements with the 3 biggest neighboring school districts to capture data on any of our kids who migrated to those districts. And that enabled us to essentially recapture 58% of all the children who were in our original sample dating back to the fall of 2006 for the bulk of our analysis. We went a step further in looking at standardized test score outcomes. For those outcome variables, we decided to get a data sharing agreement with the state of Oklahoma, so that if a child migrated to any public school anywhere in the state of Oklahoma, we would have that child in our database and we would be able to look at that child's test outcomes. And so for those particular outcomes, we were able to recapture data for 75% of the original students that we had tried to track from the fall of 2006 on. Okay. I'm just going to report very quickly on some Head Start findings, because those are the ones that we've published. And our findings on the school-based program are on their way. They're in the process of peer review, and we hope to be able to release them before long. So what did we find for the Tulsa Head Start program and 7th grade effects? We found that there are math effects but not reading effects, that as of grade 7, you can still differentiate between the kids who were exposed to the early childhood education program in Tulsa and the kids who were not. They were distinguishable for math outcomes. They were not distinguishable for reading outcomes. We found that those effects were noticeable for white children and for Hispanic children. They were not noticeable for African American children. The effect sizes were modest, 0.13 for those of you who look at this thing, so I don't want to exaggerate the effects, but they were statistically significant. And as many researchers have noted over the years, sometimes these small effect sizes can have important consequences for outcomes we care about. I'm going to give you one example of that in a moment. We also looked at school progress and behavior, and here we found, as of grade 7, that there were grade retention effects, that the 7th graders who had been in Head Start were noticeably less likely to have been retained in grade than the 7th graders who were not in Head Start or were not in the school-based pre-K program. We also found differences in chronic absenteeism, which is to say that the Head Start alums were less likely to be chronically absent in the classroom in middle school than comparable non-alums. This gives you the grade retention findings, and you can see that as of middle school, there is still a noticeable difference in grade retention between the kids who had the good fortune of being in the Head Start program and comparable kids who did not. In a nutshell, there's a 7% difference between the two groups, or to put it another way, the CAP Head Start program decreases grade retention by 33%. So, putting Tulsa results in perspective, This is luckily not the only study out there. You've heard about the Tennessee study, which is exceptionally well crafted and well executed. There are some other studies out there which are also, I would argue, highly credible. And so, to put the results in perspective, what are some of those other studies telling us? Here is my capsule summary of those other studies. Evidence from multiple states and cities shows short-term gains or improvements in school readiness. So that's the first finding. Second, evidence from multiple sites shows fade out over time. So fade out is a problem, fade out is a reality. Studies conducted by lots of researchers looking at very different programs, using very different estimating techniques or methodologies, have absolutely found evidence of fade out. On the other hand, evidence from multiple sites, with the notable exception of Tennessee, that have looked at contemporary pre-K programs, not Perry, not Abecedarian, not even the Chicago Parent Center's program, which is a little more contemporary than the other two. Studies looking at contemporary pre-K programs which have begun to follow kids who are aging and traveling through the process have, with the notable exception and the troubling exception of Tennessee, shown longer-term gains. Not necessarily big gains, but longer-term gains. So this is my own summary of some of those studies. You can see consistently evidence of short-term gains from these multiple studies in multiple states. You can see consistently evidence of fade-out, and you can see, with the exception of Tennessee, some evidence of persistence of effects over time. Not just in Oklahoma, not just in Tulsa, but in other states as well. So I want to be mindful of my time here so that there's time for questions. But let me just say, even though you indicated earlier that this is not going to be a workshop that focuses in particular on economics, I would like to say just a word or two about benefit cost studies, because I think that is a useful way to try to tease out the implications of some of these findings for public officials who have to make difficult choices and have to decide whether to fund program X or program Y, at what level to fund program X, how generous to be. And so it's, I think, perfectly legitimate for public officials at the state and local levels to ask, do the benefits exceed the costs? And we've tried to do some of that with our work in Tulsa. We did it with Tim Bartik, who is an economist at the Upshaw Institute. We've worked with him on a couple studies in which we try to extrapolate from early differences between treatment group and control group children, linking Tulsa data to national data, in this instance to national data on adult earnings that we can link to differences in kindergarten test scores. And so these are the results from one of those benefit cost studies in which we estimate that the benefits of the Tulsa pre-K program exceed the costs by 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. Benefit cost analysis depends on lots of different decisions that you make, and we have always been cognizant that there are different ways to conduct a benefit cost analysis and that you might reach somewhat different conclusions. So with that in mind, more recently, we did some, let's see, have we done that? I don't want to go too far ahead here. There we go. Yeah. More recently, we've taken a somewhat different strategy to measuring benefits and costs in Tulsa, and that strategy is to zero in on grade retention effects. So I mentioned that we are seeing in Tulsa some effects on grade retention for the Head Start program. We're also seeing effects on grade retention for the school-based program. And what we've done in concert with Tim Bartik has been to take our estimates of effects of participating in the Tulsa Pre-K program on grade retention, and then to graft them onto an analysis using national data of the effects of grade retention on adult earnings and the effects of grade retention on crime. And so splicing together all of that information, we've come up with a newer, different estimate that offers a partial benefit cost analysis for the Tulsa program using more recent data focusing just on effects that are transmitted through grade retention. So I hope that makes sense. There may be other effects above and beyond the effects that are transmitted through grade retention. We haven't done that. But if you look just at the effects that are transmitted through grade retention, you see we're getting a benefit cost ratio of about 2 to 1 using the best techniques that we can use, using the best contemporary data that we can use from our most recent analysis. I'm not going to focus that much on Ohio. Andy's already shown you this chart. You probably know that chart better than I do, since it's something you live with. I guess I would say that what I've heard from your city council member and what I've heard from others talking about Ohio is that Ohio seems to be on the move and Columbus seems to be on the move, and you're making progress. And you have a governor who's supportive of some of these initiatives, which is great. You have a mayor and a city council who's supportive of these initiatives in Columbus. You have some other cities that are really keen on making some progress. So all of that is great. What advice would I offer as an outsider coming in to public officials who are making some of these decisions? First, that you should design a program that broadens access to high quality pre-K. I think that's really important. That access is very important too, but from my vantage point, the research that has been done that people are paying attention to and that public officials are drawing lessons from is research that in most instances is looking not just at the effects of pre-K, but at the effects of high quality pre-K. So if you have a program that's not high quality, you may not be getting the kinds of results that we're seeing in Tulsa or that you're seeing in some other states and jurisdictions. Second, I think that public officials should learn from evidence from multiple studies when they design a program. There are lots of studies out there. You've heard about the Tennessee study and you've heard about the Tulsa study, but there are a lot of other really good, very relevant studies out there that should also be part of the national conversation. Third, it's very important when you're looking at long-term effects to focus not just on pre-K and what the pre-K teachers are doing in the classroom, important though that is. It's also vitally important to ask what is going on in K through 3. So as I thought about some of the results that Dale reported from Tennessee, my reaction was, the first set of perception findings from the teachers, the kindergarten teachers, suggests at least perceptually that the program was working to boost school readiness, and that's consistent with her hard evidence too. But then the teachers are reporting something different after that, and I'm inclined to think that some of that may have to do with what is or is not happening in K through 3 classrooms in Tennessee, and not just what is or is not happening in pre-K classrooms. And I would make the same comment about Tulsa as well. Finally, and here is maybe where there's some convergence between Dale's position and her presentation and mine. I do think that we need to define pre-K and its mission broadly enough to include critical thinking, to include creative thinking, to include problem solving, to try to promote intellectual curiosity, to try to help students, including 4-year-olds, to learn through activities that are creatively designed and sensitively implemented that enable them to combine play with learning. So there's a lot of things we can do, that we should do, that would move us down the field, and I hope that we'll do that soon. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to accept a few questions. Yes. Oh, yeah. They are, I can't tell you their names, but they are authentic Tulsa public schools pre-K children. Yes. And I can't tell you any inside story of whether they're best buddies outside the classroom. But yes. Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Is there a pattern to the early returns from multiple studies in multiple states? And I should say most of those studies have reported on elementary school outcomes. Very few have been able to look yet at middle school outcomes or high school, just because we don't have those data. Is there a pattern? It's hard to connect the dots. It's very hard. But if there's a pattern, I would say that several of those studies, including ours, are seeing grade retention effects. Now, that's not in every instance, because Dale told you that's not what they're seeing in Tennessee. So it's not true in every instance, but I see that in a number of states. And if that's true, that's important, because grade retention has been shown in many different studies by many different investigators to have important, profoundly negative consequences for children in their later years, even after you control for other variables. Other questions? Yes. Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. We do have some data on families, and it's entirely possible that attendance is a function of not just family income, but more specifically transportation difficulties. We don't have data on that in particular. We would like to know more about that. And if we knew more about that, we might be able to reduce chronic absenteeism, not just for kids who have participated in a pre-K program, but for kids overall. I think that's a very important goal. Other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, well, those are great questions. So I should have mentioned that when we did our Tulsa research, we did look at the short-term effects on social-emotional development. And what we found, using some measures from Fantuzzo and McDermott, two psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania, was that there was a reduction in timidity. And using some self-regulation data from a truncated version of a widely used scale on self-regulation, we found that there was an improvement in attentiveness. There were not any differences in aggressiveness or hyperactivity, and the effects were modest. But nevertheless, we did find for kids who are in the Tulsa Public Schools pre-K program that there were improvements in their attentiveness and reductions in their timidity that occurred rather quickly. So then the question is, do those effects persist over time? We're not really in a good position to answer that question with our Tulsa data just because of the data we have at our disposal. There are some studies out there that have looked at social-emotional learning. There's the study of the Fast Track program by Karen Bierman and her colleagues, and that does suggest that short-term gains in social-emotional learning can persist, although it's important to note that the Fast Track program is a multi-year program. And so it may be that if you really want to see those social-emotional gains persist, that you need to continue to stress life skills beyond pre-K, well into elementary school, and the evidence suggests that that could be beneficial. There's another study by a political scientist at Duke that suggests that kids who acquire some of these life skills or social-emotional skills wind up being better citizens later on. They wind up voting at higher rates. So that to me is intriguing, the possibility that as we improve some of these life skills through carefully designed curricula and instruction, that we might be able to improve students' future civic skills as well. I think that's a very important goal. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent synopsis of years of work. I was wondering how old those kids are now. 16? 16. Okay. Follow them into college. Okay. Well, thank you. We're going to take a shift now, and as we developed this symposium, and I see Tanny just stepped out for a second, but we had a lot of conversations about how to make the day really rich, and we knew that we were going to have several research presentations because we always do that. But as we conversed about the day, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to bring in people from cities that have recently and significantly expanded in the area of pre-K and hear about their experience. We're calling it, like, what is your boots on the ground experience? How do you get from an idea to implementation? And so we reached out to people in DC, and I've known Jack for a pretty long time, since you first started thinking about this, well, maybe. And we reached out to DC and NYC to come and talk to us, and each constituents from both prepared brief presentations, and it was pretty wide open. Share with us what you think we should be thinking about as we consider pre-K expansion, either as a researcher or a policymaker or a practitioner. It's just a great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Jack McCarthy, a true pioneer in the world of early education. Is this your second career? Did you start? Were you in the .com industry? No, I wish. Oh, that's, yes. So, but maybe you'll share some of your background, but I know him as president and CEO of Apple Tree Institute for Education Innovation in DC. I visited there a number of times when you were first getting started. It's a public charter school that currently, a public preschool charter, public charter preschool, which we don't have in Ohio, currently serving about 1,200 kids, and I think the charter movement was part of pre-K expansion in DC. So we asked you to come and talk to us about what has happened in DC. So welcome and thanks for joining us.
So hopefully get me set up here.
You got it.
Just a couple of thoughts while we're getting set up here. what I think is really, I am more a social entrepreneur than an early childhood researcher, so I say that as a caveat and not as an excuse, but merely just to have you think about. Laura sort of referenced that I got into this later in my career. I, like many people in this room, sort of got tricked into this by a friend, and when I realized how important this issue was, and sort of how many people really want access to quality education for their children and what they'll do for it, it made me realize that there was nothing more important that I could do. And so one of the things that sort of guide our thinking at Apple Tree are core values. And our core values are mission first. And our mission is to try to close the achievement gap before children enter kindergarten. And it's a mission and it's a goal, and I think that's really important because it guides a lot of what we do. And I think that's one thing that this movement needs if we're going to be successful, to have clear goals and to have a sense of mission. The second thing is something that I think is really important for all of education, and our second value is trust among the adults. And when we think in terms of doing evaluations, implementing programs, getting feedback, thinking about what we do to improve things, you really have to have that sense of trust among the adults, that you're not playing gotcha, that you're not being set up for failure, that what you're doing is really important, and that everybody respects each other. Because I think when you have that value, if you have trust among the adults, you really can accomplish anything, but if you don't have trust among the adults, it's really hard to get out of your own way. And then the other three values that sort of guide us overall are research to practice. We only do things that are based on evidence. And the evidence changes over time. So that's why we have a continuous improvement approach to what we do. And I think this is all important in this movement. Sometimes when you find there's a better way to do something, you make that adjustment. And that's how things improve over time. And then finally, to be solution focused, because it's really important for us to get some solutions and not celebrate problems. I mean, a lot of times we spend a lot of time celebrating problems. But I mean, there are some real solutions that we've got to get to. And so I think those core values sort of will help frame some of the observations that I'm going to make about universal pre-K in DC. And also, it's always a wonderful experience when you're asked to come in and tell a history. It would be sort of like, I'm going to tell you about how the Declaration of Independence was written. And then as you're walking in the room, you know, you see Ben Franklin, and you say, oh, well, Ben was here. Well, he probably could tell you a lot more about this. So, I mean, Maurice Sykes is here, who experienced... Would you be John Adams, or would you be Thomas Jefferson? Okay, so anyway, well, I mean, Franklin was having so much fun during that process. That's why I was thinking of you. But anyway, you know, Maurice, blood, sweat, toil, and tears in this universal pre-K movement in Washington, D.C., and played an extraordinary leadership role in making this come together. So anyways, I just wanted to salute you, Maurice. So anyway, thank you very much to Laura and to the Crane Center for inviting me today. Let's see. Oops, this isn't working again. All right, if anyone can help me. It moved too. Okay, here we are. So anyway, first let me tell you what Apple Tree is. Apple Tree is a nonprofit research institute that also operates a network of charter preschools. In Washington, D.C., we have 10 preschools, 1,250 kids enrolled. We also have 8 partner schools and community-based organizations that enroll about 1,500 children in the district. We won an I3 grant in 2010 in the first cohort to develop Every Child Ready, which is a comprehensive evidence-based instructional model for 3- and 4-year-old children. It emphasizes what to teach, how to teach, and how to know it's working. So it has measurement involved. And it's currently being used to teach about 42% of the children who are in public charter schools, public charter preschools in Washington, D.C. So what we'll discuss today is how DC's universal pre-K law is changing the research policy and practice landscape, talk about some of the opportunities and the challenges, some of the intended and unintended consequences, and talk about growing effective preschool practices and programs, and then finally I'll make some recommendations from our experience with boots on the ground, as Laura likes to say. So there was a history that I made available, and I think you had a link if you really wanted to see the really in-depth case study as to how early childhood policy has evolved over the years in Washington, D.C. And it really goes back to World War II. And when you think in terms of Washington, D.C. and the mobilization for the war effort, there was a huge infusion of young women who were working in the Pentagon and in the government at the end of the New Deal. The United Planning Organization had the first Head Start pilots in 1960s. Those people who live in Washington, D.C. recognize that often the city is a place where the federal government loves to experiment. That's one of the good and the bad things. So this was one of the first Head Start centers in 1960. Maurice was involved with the Anacostia Child Care Center that was founded in the 1980s with strong business support. And one of the little-known facts about D.C. is it has one of the highest ratios of females to males in the United States. It also has significant neighborhoods of entrenched poverty. So what problems was D.C. trying to solve? So in the spirit of continuous improvement, when I saw Maurice outside, he let me know about something that was not in the case study that I think is really interesting. Initially, when the Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Act was being developed, it was going to bring much needed dollars in for birth through 5 programs. And as part of the sausage making business, as Dale talks about, which this really is, I mean, on the implementation side, on the policy side, this is all sausage making business. They needed, in order to get the pre-K part passed, they needed to sacrifice the birth through 3 element of it because a council member who later ran for mayor and was defeated just thought, thought that it really wasn't important. What was the term, Maurice? Trivialize the legislation. So sometimes, I think earlier we talked about Sophie's choice. Sometimes you have to make these kinds of choices in policy. And I think in this case, while that is still a big problem that people are working on in Washington, D.C., moving forward with funding for 3- and 4-year-olds has been very important. I think will be very important to the city. So anyway, in 2000, 70% of kids had access to some kind of early care and education in Washington, D.C. But like across the country, it ranges across the spectrum from really low quality to extraordinary programs. 3 out of every 5 live births in Washington, D.C. are to single mothers living in poverty. Think about that in our nation's capital. There had been limited pre-K programs in D.C. public schools for quite some time. CBOs were struggling with a reimbursement system that really made it hard to deliver early care programs. And at the same time, there were research and advocacy efforts that were arguing for greater investments in early education to improve child outcomes. So there was a lot going on, and it was an opportunity for leadership and action. So with Maurice and others, the top business leaders in Washington, D.C. got behind this effort, but it took some time. And with strong support from Pew and Kellogg and others, and a political leader that I think had a great vision, Vincent Gray, who was council chairman at the time, working with people like Kerry Thornhill, people like Maurice and others, really put together a bill that got unanimous council support, which is really pretty extraordinary. Now, at the same time that this was going on, Washington, D.C. was making headlines around the country because Michelle Rhee had come in, Mayor Fenty had come in, taken mayoral control. And so you had these 2 sort of extraordinary things going on at the same time, which was, really really quite amazing. Oop. Sorry. So, okay, this is good. Looks different here. So the expected beneficiaries of this act were to be the community-based organizations that were already operating many of the birth through 3 programs. And it was really intended to provide them with more predictable funding and a higher level of funding so that they could continue to provide that robust level of programming. And what happened was something different. Thanks for bearing with me here. DC has something that I think is really important in terms of funding. It has a uniform per student funding formula, which provides a robust level of public funding. So in other words, preschools and pre-kindergartens are funded the same way that the public schools are, because we have 3 sectors. We have DC public schools, we have DC public charter schools, and we have community-based organizations. So this was basically trying to raise the amount of money and make it follow the child for the community-based organizations in the same way that the charters and the public schools had. This diversified delivery system provides choice and variety, which I think is really important because it breeds competition and innovation, and that is really important for parents. But it also has fostered a growing interest in quality improvement as the market expands and more parents start to understand what quality early education can be. So here are some of the intended and unintended consequences. So it stimulated great interest in pre-K, but the community-based organizations ended up not being the big winners. The public charter schools and DC public schools became the big winners. DCPS ended up expanding, I think, about 2,400 seats in 1 year by blending Title I pre-K classrooms with Head Start classrooms to expand services. Chancellor Rhee at the time put in Montessori programs for middle-class parents because there was a real effort to try to bring white parents back into DC public schools. And what happened was that some of these preschool classrooms, when it's expanded this quickly, the chancellor at the time was working on contracts and trying to reform DCPS. And I don't know how to say this well, but basically by expanding these 2,400 seats, there now became places for people who were deemed not to be very good at teaching 2nd grade or 3rd grade to go, where there weren't really measurements to test their effectiveness, but they could serve in a program. And that's a real unintended consequence when you're thinking in terms of how do we use this to boost children's learning. And then there were, because of this innovative blended approach, there were difficulties in reporting the finances. DCPS has long had, a history of having difficulty reporting on finances, and it ended up putting the lead Head Start agency into recompetition as a result of that. So new does not always equal good, and the CBOs were not really competitive anymore because people wanted to enter a charter school and have a pathway that would take their kids through 8. They didn't want to enter into multiple lotteries. So CBOs started to lose significant market share to charters and to DC public schools. So how universal is universal? This is from the report that's in your packet from the Office of the State Superintendent. You can see that overall about 77% of the 16,409 3- and 4-year-olds currently in programs, but look at the note down below. There are still kids who are in full-day subsidized daycare. So this kind of goes back to the thing I'm talking about with goals. I think that DC has done a great job in providing funding and making a commitment to doing this, but where there's still room for growth is in really defining what quality means in terms of children's outcomes and sort of laying that across the policy programs. Like, for example, if you're going to be educating 3- and 4-year-old students, regardless of whether you're a charter school or DCPS or a community-based organization, there are certain things that we expect those children to get from their experiences. And that's still very much a work in progress. So this shows you the breakdown by sector. And this is, again, from 2015. The top line is DC Public Schools. They enroll about 5,615 kids. And you can see they're pretty much, there's not a lot of excess capacity there. Same with the DC Public Charter Schools, 58 sites, 6,425, 94% utilization rate. So you can see that people are taking advantage of it, but this too has intended and unintended consequences. Like, for example, when charters took off after the act was passed and where they're creating a lot of additional seats, history of the charter school movement has mostly been driven by middle school models. And that's because early on when charters were thought of as policy, as a policy idea, there was this fourth grade reading gap, and the idea was, can you, over a period of time, using extra time of the day and, a variety of different strategies, build the capacity of kids to do a lot better in those, those middle school years. Well, as those same middle school charter founders started migrating down to elementary school and to preschool, sort of what worked with middle school was being applied to primary school and then to preschool. And so it wasn't always necessarily great for kids. And in the absence of clear goals and in the absence of best practice, I think a lot of kids were even though there was access, it wasn't necessarily great quality. So again, another unintended consequence. You're in a jurisdiction that is not providing the kind of robust funding and universal access. And it's sort of like, what problem would you like to solve first? Would you like to figure everything out first and then get funding? Or would you like to have funding and then create an environment where you've got the capacity to start to figure all these things out? And that's why I really think what DC did was important, because it put the funding in place so that the philanthropic dollars or the government dollars that are being invested for quality improvement in a diversified delivery system can really be applied, and you can research and you can see what's working, and quality is being improved over time. But it doesn't happen like that the minute you get a law passed. So, what are some of the challenges here? Everyone wants quality, but it means very different things to different people, as we all know. I think one of the big takeaways, sort of being an operator and having talked with a lot of people around the country, some of whom are other people who are being evaluated in some of these major studies. When you have a program like a Head Start, or you have a program that's like we started operating our program with TANF childcare subsidies, each of these funding sources have compliance systems that you have to adhere to. And oftentimes when we think about braiding funding or cobbling dollars together in order to do something that is new and better, we overlook the fact that these compliance systems really are demanding in terms of people's time. And usually these programs are sort of under-resourced as it is. And so this idea of trying to take the existing program dollars and braid them, I think, is not necessarily the right approach. I think that if we're going to define quality in terms of children's outcomes and in terms of school readiness, I think we need to define programs and fund programs that are designed and aligned to accomplish that. And so that's one challenge. What goals can we define? I mean, closing the achievement gap is a goal, but it's really kind of hard to define, because one of the things that we have found is that those darn kids at the top that we're trying to catch just keep learning. And so what you're trying to do is continue to dramatically raise this trajectory. And I sort of, one of the neat things I like about being involved with this is every now and then you have an epiphany, and I thought Dale's iceberg chart for me was like, a paradigm shift, because those things that you can affect, are at the top. And, there are different ways to go at that. But those things below are the things that are really hard to teach teachers to teach and to sustain. And when you're thinking about growth, and you're thinking about the kind of rollouts like in New York or in Washington, D.C., there aren't millions of people who are extraordinarily gifted early childhood educators that are sitting around to jump into these classrooms when you put the classified ad in the paper. You know, so this is really a challenge of finding people who have the attributes, finding the money to develop really good programs and to continuously improve them as we learn more about what works, and then sustaining and operating those, you know, again and again and again. So that's really the challenge. It's not that we shouldn't be funding these programs and doing this work, but it's always going to be hard. It's not like you flip a switch, hey, you've got the money, let's go. It's continuous improvement. It's very, very, very hard work. So the other question, our friends from New York were talking about this, so I hope you talk about this later. When you roll something like this out, and it's public money, and you're sort of creating something new, who provides support? And then who conducts the oversight? You know, in a way, there's no capacity to provide support because you've started a new initiative, unless there's a philanthropic arm attached to a university or to a community-based organization. So, you know, wearing those two hats and being fair and being an umpire but also being a coach, you know, the roles don't necessarily always go together, and that's a really hard challenge when you're trying to bring something like this to scale. So lessons learned. Different accountability systems produce different kinds of quality. In Washington, D.C., there's been an ongoing attempt to develop quality rating improvement systems, you know, which are good. But when we operate as a charter school, we aren't necessarily required to do all of the things that other programs do. Now, we have Head Start classrooms. We co-enroll about 100 Head Start students. We went through the process of crosswalking the Head Start standards with what we do. And someone can come in who's at Head Start, who is, you know, auditing a program, and they'll see everything that we're doing that should be done in the Head Start program. But I'm not sure how many of those things, if our goal is to prepare kids to enter school ready to learn, maybe some of those things could go away or be stipulated, you know, while we're focusing on other goals, maybe setting other goals. And that's just something to think about because right now, these compliance systems really take up a lot of human capital. Diversified delivery systems. We all have biases, and I am sure that somewhere in the state of Ohio there is someone who's had a bad experience with a charter school and may say, I don't like charter schools. And there may be someone at a charter school who says, I had a bad experience with a district school. Or there may be somebody who's at both of those who said, I had a bad experience with a community-based organization. But the thing is, I think diversification in the delivery systems is really important because it gives you the opportunity to do things that are new and different. And I think in deciding how the things are going to be funded, starting with as clean a slate as possible and eliminating as many of the regs as possible with some clear goals and some oversight, but allowing innovation to occur to focus around those key things that we know are important for children's success in school careers and life, really gives people then the flexibility to try to do things differently. When you're really constrained in terms of your funding sources, your program inputs, it's hard to really make things better. And that's just something I can't underscore. We had the freedom and the ability to do that differently, and that's because we were able to do it as a charter school, excuse me. But you could do it under performance contracts. You could call it, you know, anything, but just having it more outcome-oriented and making the funding more robust. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? Okay, great. So, lessons learned from measurement. There are people here who are much better at explaining this than I, but class is one of the accountability measures in DC. And the way I look at it is people thought we had to have something, and so let's start with this because this is what other people are using. But there's a thing called Campbell's Law that you might be familiar with. And what Campbell's law reads, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And so the point is not to have quality measures. The point is, I think we need to be flexible. I think we need to be resolute in deciding what are the things that are important. And we should have fewer rather than more, I think. But then, once we have those in place, we should be really flexible. And we should think about when someone develops a better tool, let's pilot it. Let's not lock these things in place for 10 years and expect that things are going to continue to get better. And the problem in operating programs, particularly when you're trying to do program improvement and accountability, is that most of the tools that really tell you a lot are really expensive. They're really expensive to administer, and they're time consuming, and unless you really have a great operation getting the information back to teachers real quickly, Dale was talking about how they turn that around quickly. We ended up developing sort of like quick and dirty tools that were they're not dirty, but they're easy to use. But the idea is that everything you use really should help inform the teachers what's going on with kids. It should be useful to the site administrator, and it should be useful for accountability purposes, like reporting on what kind of progress you're making. And that's a place where I think a lot of investment has to be made, because those tools don't exist today. And I think that's an opportunity for growth. I guess the other lessons are all of these things are really complicated and expensive to measure, and that professional development really needs to be robust and ongoing and in your school. And right now, unless you have an independent funding source or you have a robust level of funding that allows you to build this into your operating programs, it's going to be sporadic, not very good, or inconsistent. So, good news. Using the established quality measurements, a growing number of preschool classrooms are providing children with quality early learning experiences. So these are just under the tools that are being used now. Things are going in the right direction in DC. Parents are becoming more knowledgeable about what quality early learning experiences can mean for their children's success, so people are excited about what's going on. There's a desire to improve among operators, and early data is encouraging. The nation's report card for fourth grade reading scores have gone up slightly in Washington, D.C., which is different from what we've been experiencing for the last 30 years. So these are my recommendations, and I think I've sort of talked through most of these already. But I think it's really important. The hardest thing is to get a bunch of people who are involved in early childhood education and then some people in business and philanthropy to sit down and say, what's really important? What do we really, really expect these programs to deliver? And then if we can agree on that, okay, so what's involved with doing that? How do we fund those and how do we sustain those? And that's the discussion. Sometimes the advocacy gets ahead of the policy making, and we're so enthusiastic talking about how every dollar will return $7 to $17, but we know every program doesn't do that. And so I think just having those honest conversations, building trust among the adults, and saying what are the things that we really expect to do this, and then how can we be flexible in creating environments for this to occur, has to be part of the policy discussion. And then rinse and repeat every 3 to 5 years. And what I mean by that is, like, as we do this, continuous improvement really is important. Looking and seeing what's working, getting rid of what isn't working or improving is really important so that we can meet our mission. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. I think it was the first time I've ever heard someone speak on this topic and say several times that we need fewer regs. But I agree with you completely, because compliance is really tough, and especially when you're trying to braid funds to create diverse classrooms for kids, you're spending all your time on compliance. So I applaud you for that comment. And this almost brings us to the end, but not quite. I'm really excited to introduce Xanthi Jory and Lucas Kaler from the New York City Department of Education. We're all going to come visit you in New York City to see what you're doing. The New York City Department of Education is the largest school district in the United States. So talk about a challenge. They're serving 1.1 million kids in 1,800 schools. That's a pretty big job. I don't know the history that well, but from what I can infer, in 2013, Bill de Blasio, in running for mayor, really pushed a pre-K agenda and ran on that platform. And so today, several years later, after he was elected, your NYC preschool program serves more children than any state system except for Georgia. So we're really excited to hear about what I'm assuming has been a bit of a marathon the last couple years. So thank you so much for coming from New York City.
Thanks so much, Laura. We are excited to be here. We didn't actually bring our boots with us for our boots on the ground perspective, but Laura is correct that we are just kind of emerging from the trenches, and so it's really exciting for us to be here and hear from researchers and other cities around the country and start to think about our work in a broader context. It's really excellent. So Laura, you were exactly right about the recent history of pre-K in New York. Our mayor, Bill de Blasio, campaigned on a pre-K promise to create a seat for every 4-year-old in New York City. We have about 110,000 4-year-olds in New York City, and the expectation was that within 2 years we would go from serving 20,000 children in full-day free pre-K to serving over 70,000 children. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we've done that and what we think we've learned, although we're still figuring out what we have learned. Oh, the button is really finicky, huh? There. Oh.
Oh no, we lost our graphic. Oh wait, here it is. Just an extra slide there. There we go.
Okay. So we have a diverse delivery model. Our pre-K settings run the gamut. We have about 40% of our seats in district elementary schools or a setting called pre-K centers, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but these are a new setting for us that the district has created that only serve 4-year-olds but are run like a district school. We have a handful of charter schools that serve as contracted vendors and providers under a DOE pre-K contract. The pre-K centers, which I just mentioned, which are district run. And then we have our NYCECs, as we call them, the New York Early Childhood Education Centers, and within that category there is a really broad range of types of providers. So we contract with very old, large, established nonprofits that have been doing early childhood programs for a long time. We have a large number of small, family-run, kind of mom-and-pop daycare centers that had been also providing early childhood services potentially for a long time, but are new to the pre-K setting. We work with some home-based providers, a small number. Our Head Start programs are in the mix here. And also we have a lot of parochial schools that are offering public pre-K within their existing school system. So really wide-ranging in terms of our settings. That said, there are a number of things that we try to be very consistent about across our entire portfolio of programs. So one thing is that we have developed a set of program quality standards. We are attempting to do what Jack is describing and really think hard about what we are looking for and what quality means to us at a program level in New York City. I'm sure we haven't got that quite right yet, but we're proud to have released a set of quality standards, and we're starting to structure many different parts of our program or anchor them in these quality standards. And those sort of apply evenly across our entire portfolio. And they're available on our website if anybody's interested. We offer differentiated support. So what I mean by that is that we have a number of different types of staff within our division that support pre-K programs directly. And the support model that is received by any program is not dependent on the setting, but rather dependent on what the data shows us are some of the biggest needs and strengths of the program. So we use a number of different data points to make some decisions at the beginning of the year about how to allocate our resources, our support resources for each program, and then we adjust those resources several times throughout the year based on what we're seeing in terms of progress or lack of progress. We also do, we have a pretty robust program assessment arm that forms the backbone of our accountability and oversight work. And that is also sort of consistently implemented across our entire portfolio, although it is also still a work in progress to be sure. So right now we are implementing Class and ECHRS with an in-house team of about 30 staff. Last year we performed about 1,200 Class and ECHRS assessments across our portfolio. And our goal is that each program will be on a 3-year cycle so that in the course of 3 years they will receive at least one class and at least one ECHRS, and then either have a year off or they'll receive another of one of those 2 assessments depending on their situation.
This slide shows, this table shows our full day enrollment broken down by setting type, as just described, and from the year before expansion through a snapshot of where we are in the current year. And so there are a few stories that I'd like to highlight in these data. One, the first is the existing full day program in our district schools. Of that original 20,000, the great majority were housed in the district operated schools. But there was still dramatic growth in that group as we found additional space and stood up programs in schools that had not previously housed them. The next line, the NYSEEKs, the contracted providers. Here, one significant part of the story is the conversion of the half-day program to the full-day program. It was also part of the story with the district schools, but in the NYSEEKs, they, during fiscal 14, school year 13-14, there were about 55,000 children enrolled, 20,000 in full day, 35,000 in half day. And so the huge growth that we see in the NYSEEKs is also offset by the reduction in the half day program there. One component of which, and I'll dive into a detail here, are the programs run by a partner agency, the Administration for Children's Services, which is the Head Start Super Grantee in New York City. They receive both Head Start and Child Care Block Grant funding. And so those children in the ACS programs, they serve about 10,000 children. Prior to expansion, Department of Education, through a state grant, funded a half day of their services, with the remaining 8 to 10 hours of care for their children being funded by Head Start and Block Grant. And as part of the expansion, we increased the amount of funding that Department of Education transferred to their agency and extended the educational programmatic day to 6 hours and 20 minutes, making sure that they were consistent with our expectations in all areas. The next line, the pre-K centers. As we were meeting demand in all neighborhoods and meeting local needs, we began to run out of community-based providers that were able to serve in those communities and district school space. Some of our toughest neighborhoods were places where we had already exhausted all of the available district school space, and so we stood up these programs, district run and operated, sometimes in retail space, sometimes in new school construction where there were phasing in schools. And so there was an initial, just one program in school year 14-15, and then you can see the very rapid expansion to a considerable, small but considerable portion of the program. I mentioned briefly one of our challenges being geographical location. We needed to make sure that the seats that we were standing up were in neighborhoods where children needed them. This slide shows two maps, one from between year 1 and year 2 of expansion, and then between year 2 and year 3 of expansion, of how we approached demand. Early on, we had used kindergarten enrollment as a proxy for where we believed pre-K students would need seats. And subsequently, as the program grew and we had application data from families, we used actual enrollment and families' expressed preferences through the application process to identify, to create a demand estimate. So these maps show an early on difference between our demand estimate and actual seat supply. That's the map on the left, with the red indicating areas where we were had exceeded, where our demand estimate exceeded the level of supply, and green where we had met or even exceeded with supply the demand estimate. And so the transition here was from there being really broad-based unmet demand to having essentially met that very localized demand in every neighborhood with a few remaining hotspots. We took a very narrow view, and so without diving too deeply into it, the geographical unit of division here is the elementary school zone catchment area, because we knew that we had seen in existing data and in our preliminary data that a primary, deciding factor for families about attending programs was convenience and literal ability to bring their kids to the program.
In scaling up, one of the things we did was significantly build our team. We're going to walk you through our org chart, mostly because it's instructive in terms of how we think about the work and how we allocate resources to different pieces of the work. So we have 6 teams in our division. The first is our teaching and learning team. That's the team that includes about 100 instructional coaches that are out in the field on a daily basis. They manage our coaching and support programs. They have developed our curriculum units, which is another resource that we developed for our programs last year. And they also manage our professional learning program. We provide 4 full days of PD for all teachers in our system, in addition to the on-site coaching. We also have a unit that's devoted to family engagement, and they are really focused on supporting programs as well. They, in particular, focus on improving family engagement practices at the program level, and we, among the 100 social workers, that we have 20 behavioral specialists. So those folks are out in the field frequently, working with programs who are struggling to manage kids or populations that are demonstrating needs that the programs are sort of not equipped to meet. So they do some really intense coaching around how to meet the needs of particular children and groups of kids. The next team is my team, the Expansion Policy and Performance team. So my team has 3 focuses. One is the work that we do around creating seats. So a lot of the things we've just been talking about have been led by one of my teams. We also have a policy team. The policy team tackles policy issues from the micro, and by micro, it's like, you know, do we have a lice policy that applies to all programs across the district? All the way up to the macro level policy questions around teacher certification or how we might influence state policy, or we've just sort of forced a change in the New York City Health Code. So some really interesting work there as well. I also manage our performance team, which is the team that conducts the program assessments across our portfolio. And the policy and performance teams are also both really deeply involved in some of our accountability work, thinking about how we work with our most struggling sites, and you know, both in a more intense interventionist capacity, and then also when we make decisions about termination of programs. I'll let Lucas continue on the right half.
you. So the data and analytics team is my team. We support all of the various other teams here shown, broadly both with analysis and systems development and support. The analysis, the demand analysis that I showed before is one example. For the supporting the teaching and learning and family engagement teams, we've both developed a coaching log that allows the social workers and instructional coaches to record information, goals, next steps, and results from their visits that they can share with each other, with their supervisors, with, and we've also helped them think about their model, looking at some clustering of programs to understand what interventions for a particular program might be, how the data profile of a program might suggest it's an ideal intervention, as well as bringing together the various data points that would help them bring a level of support to programs. The field operations team supports primarily our relationships with the contracted providers. They have geographically divided the city. Their leadership negotiates the budgets for the contract, and their analysts process payments, invoices, and handle compliance issues. Lastly, our divisional operations team provides human resources, budget support to all of the remaining teams.
Wait, hang on one sec.
Yes.
So something that seems to have dropped off our slide is that we also have some really key partners elsewhere within the Department of Education in New York City, as well as other city agencies. One thing that we've learned is pretty unique to our program is that we have an outreach team whose sole job it is to find families and convince them to apply and attend. So that is a it's like a campaign style operation, right? They have a CRM that they use, and they have, I don't know, databases of families, and they make phone calls, and they log those calls, and they're out at community events, and they're passing out palm cards, and they're going to community meetings and hanging up. I mean, you go to any New York City park, and everywhere there are these like vinyl banners that say like pre-K for all, like application period, like they're just everywhere. So that's also a really important partner to us. We work really closely with our Office of Enrollment in the Department of Education. Another thing we've done over the past couple years is develop a single centralized enrollment system that operates across our entire portfolio. So parents can apply in person at an enrollment center or on the phone. Most apply online, and they can look at a directory of all of our 2,000 programs. They rank their 12 most preferred programs, and then the computer does some magic, and they're sorted into priority groups based on certain characteristics, and families receive a single offer. About 70% of our families get one of their top 3 choices. There is a second opportunity to apply as well, so we have 2 rounds of enrollment so that we make sure that we're sorting families into the choices that they most want. So our enrollment team is also really important. They're not part of our division, but a close partner. Our contracts division is a huge and important partner for us because the work of contracting with 1,000, 1,200, we have 1,200 contracted providers. So as you all probably know, city procurement is a beast. It is really complicated and takes a long time. And so we have had to work really closely with them to refine our systems for being able to do that work. Other partners? Oh, teacher recruitment and quality. So as Laura mentioned, we are a very, very large system. And fortunately, we have a very effective and robust teacher recruitment arm that supports our entire system K to 12. So we have also folded pre-K into their work. That has been very seamless for our district schools because principals already know their work and the resources and help that they provide. It has been a little more challenging to help them understand the needs and sort of differing hiring landscape for our contracted providers. But over the past few years, they've gotten pretty good at that as well. So they're also a team that we work with really, really closely. And then outside of the department, we have a close partner in the mayor's office because pre-K is a mayoral initiative, and that's been really important. They help to coordinate the many city agencies that have been involved with our work, from the School Construction Authority, who has helped us to actually acquire and build sites for our pre-K centers, to ACS, which Lucas mentioned is the Head Start grantee and has about 10,000 pre-K seats, so they're a close partner. We work really closely with the Department of Health, which is the licensing agency for most of our contracted providers, and with like the buildings department and the fire department, because as we've brought on so many new providers so quickly, the act of permitting has become a giant work stream that requires a lot of cooperation across agencies. So there are more that I'm not thinking of right now, but that's another thing that I think we've learned has gone unusually well for us in New York, because the mayor has really made this work the priority of every city agency. And so the level of cooperation that we've had with our agency partners has been really, I guess, surprising and wonderful.
So we're going to move on to our lessons learned and try and spend the rest of the time diving into these. The first, find and seize your moment. I mean, we mentioned, Laura mentioned in the introduction and throughout that this was a mayoral priority, and we had the good fortune of having a mayor who articulated universal pre-kindergarten as a vision, who was successful in lobbying for funding from our state legislature, and then our seizing of that moment had to do with us going very quickly. And so by virtue of being able to have a plan in place and be at full scale within 2 years, we were able to make use of that full funding. And so I think it's come up that is, in some sense, that was unique and a great opportunity, and also created by our leadership.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that when we, as a city, first said that we were going to try to undertake this project in 2 years, there were many, many naysayers out there who doubted that it was possible, or doubted that it wouldn't be a disaster, or that we could focus on both expansion and quality at the same time, or you name it. And so we recognize this sort of small window as a chance to get to scale, and with the resources that we needed to do that work. And so we took advantage of that, and thankfully we were successful to a large degree in accomplishing what the mayor promised in its most basic way. Certainly we have like a ton of work to do, and I don't mean to suggest that, but there was an opportunity, and we took it, and we're grateful that we did.
As Anthony mentioned about the outreach team and the work to ensure that families came, we both built the seats, created the slots, and engaged in outreach to the community, to the city, to make sure that people would come. It was an open question, I think. Our deputy chancellor was talking recently about a moment of anxiety where he had reached a point of confidence about our ability to have the seats ready, and was unsure whether there would be families to be there on the first day. And so we paid attention to it. I don't know, I think treating it as a campaign, and we were fortunate also at the work that has been done to make the case for pre-K to the world through research, that we didn't have to relitigate that question. There was evidence we could point to when making that case to families that it was a good decision for them.
So a moment ago, I mentioned that we have attempted to focus on quality from the beginning of this process. I was talking to Jack earlier, and he asked whether we named phases of the work, like, first 3 years focus on seat creation and access, then move on to quality. My answer to him then was, in some ways it has played out that way. However, from moment one, the pitch to the governor, the legislature, the mayor, the ask for resources has included what we needed, we thought, in order to build a high quality program. So our deputy chancellor said something yesterday that it was when we needed to go back for more money, then we thought inevitably the program cost more than we expected. So when we needed to go back to our budget office for more money, it was much easier to make the ask for more money in order to serve more children, instead of making the ask of like, oh, we're serving every child, but we just need to make it better. So sort of a harder thing for the budget folks to understand. And so the fact that that was a part of the thinking was awesome. It is just this past year that we are able to turn a much greater segment of our human resources within our division to consider questions of quality. So that feels really good also. I can talk about it. So in terms of differentiation, I mentioned earlier that we attempt to tailor our support to programs to what the observed and measured need is in those programs. And we feel that that is extremely important, especially since even though we are well-resourced by a lot of standards, our resources are certainly not unlimited, and we do need to make difficult choices about how to allocate those for support. And so we have really made an effort, and this has mainly been led by our teaching and learning and family engagement departments, to figure out how to differentiate support in terms of what staff members are visiting, how frequently they're visiting, and what they are actually doing when they get there, and to align that with data that we have collected through program assessment, with data that we have collected through our escalations database, which is like basically our giant log of complaints and compliance issues, and data that we have collected through observations from the field. So really, this is, I think, a really important part of the work that we'll be doing over the next few years is refining that, and in particular, focusing on what is the work that coaches and social workers are actually doing when they get to the site, and how do we balance this question of support with accountability? When do we pull the plug? How do we? What does our sort of intense level of support for struggling programs actually look like, and how long does it last?
Our next lesson was to build on what works and adjust for scale. I mentioned before there was a large pre-K program predating the expansion to universal and to full day. And so we benefited by using working with our partners in the community-based providers for their expansion. We benefited from our partnerships with the district schools. Certainly, one of the things that is unique to our context is we're in a system with mayoral control. We are integrated with the rest of our Department of Education. Those systems were, the student enrollment system, our partnership with the Office of Student Enrollment, and that application and enrollment process, we were able to build on what they had in place for kindergarten and for middle school and for their existing processes and make use of it. In other areas, we have adjusted and innovated on our own. So my favorite example, because I'm the data guy, is that we have data systems that are there to support the 1,800 schools in the system. In addition to, in pre-K, we also have about 1,900 sites, 1,200 of which are the community-based providers that are different from the schools. So we don't use our DOE enterprise data systems. We stood up a one-off a homegrown data system that meets our immediate needs.
Yeah, I'll give another example, and Lucas is being very modest because his team has really developed amazing tools that are used throughout our division. But so the way that we procure our contracted sites is through an RFP process. And when I first arrived in the division prior to the expansion, that RFP process was paper-based. So, we'd release a call for proposals, an invitation. Applicants, would you like to be a pre-K provider? It's a competitive process. Submit your 200-page application. There were like piles of proposals all along the walls. In the past 3 years, we have done 14 RFPs and had 2,000 applicants. So, in that, a paper-based situation was no longer possible. And so we had to really push to quickly develop many, many systems to support the scale at which we were starting to work. I mean, the coaching log is another example. We've always had coaches. It was a tiny number. They wrote their notes in a notebook, and sat down with their supervisor and reviewed them. Now we have an online system where they are keeping their notes because we need to use that information in different ways than we needed to before.
Our last lesson, and this is construed broadly, is to earn confidence, and it goes to the sustainability of the program, the political sustainability of the program, the funding sustainability, is to communicate early and often with stakeholders to make sure that we've won, and stakeholders including elected officials, making sure that they know what benefits are going to the families in their districts, to communicate with the press, to the research, make sure that the research that is being done on our program is highlighted in the press. And I think that the universality of the program is a great element of earning confidence. We've had sort of advocacy in middle to upper income neighborhoods to ensure that that the services are being provided there is a good problem to have now for us, because it means that there's confidence in the public program, and that across the city, people are viewing it, have begun to view it as, I don't want to be too confident, but viewing it as what happens for their 4-year-olds, which we think will ensure the sustainability of the program.
So, as I alluded to earlier, we are still learning lessons every day. If you ask us in a week, these lessons might be a little different. And we're really curious to hear from all of our partners in other cities and research partners about the lessons that they have learned so that we can adjust ours. And excited to hear your questions now as well. So, Laura, I think that's it. Thanks. Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really just can't imagine how you scaled like that. I don't know where okay. We have just a little bit more time together. I know this is a long afternoon. It's a lot of sitting, but we do this once a year, and we try to make it as rich as possible. We have a little bit of time to do questions and answers. Again, we withheld that until now. So we have all of our panelists up front. I don't know that we have a roaming mic, so maybe when you stand up, just be loud. And we have, Charlie, you're not the first question asker.
Yeah, I don't need a mic.
Okay.
My question is, are you willing to share your quick and dirty tools? Yes, we have. They're progress monitoring tools. We call it
Every Child Ready Language and Literacy, Every Child Ready Math, and we have a positive behaviors tool that we use as well.
Thank
Yeah.
We'll be-
Contact me. I'll give you my card. Yeah.
Well, this is I guess I have to stand up too, but my question is for the NYC program, what coaching model are you using for your coaches?
So we're not the teaching and learning people, so I may not be able to answer that question in exactly the way that you're hoping. Can you just say a little more about what you're tell me more about what you want to know?
You were saying that you created the online program for your coaches.
Yes.
To document, but I wondered if you were using a particular research-based model for your ongoing coaching with your teachers. And you can't answer that, so that's.
Yeah. So I believe, and I could be wrong, that I mean I know our teaching and learning team in developing plans for coaching this year looked at a number of research-based practices. I don't know that they sort of wholeheartedly were like, we're going with this one. I think it's a little bit of a mashup between several different approaches. Unfortunately, I can't really name them. So that's something we could find out from our colleagues back in New York and share with Laura. Laura, if you want, we can follow up with that.
And I can give, I think, some of a partial answer
Oh, good.
but I'm sure that they will seek to complete it. One of the components of the coaching model was to provide differentiated levels of support. We used the program assessment data, some locally developed formative measures, and other sources of data, including the escalations and feedback from the field, to assign programs a level and type of support, where the type of support could be from an instructional coach, from a social worker, or from both. And the frequency of support could be from weekly to quarterly. And so a very high, a program could be getting a visit from a coach one week, social worker next week, coach, social worker, and on. We also built in adjustment periods, so we were making bets about our level of support centrally based on the information that we had about the programs, and we had included field feedback, but we wanted to provide the opportunity for our coaches and social workers to indicate where they thought, based on what they were seeing in the programs, where they thought they were needed more and less. So we're actually, I think it's probably happening as we speak, that we have collected their requests for increased support from themselves or from somebody on the other team. And one of the things that we see is the instructional coaches say, I'm here, but this program needs more. They're having trouble developing a positive emotional climate in the classroom. They need a social worker. So we're adjusting based on that. The log is structured to allow people to identify goals, what their goals are for the program, and those goals are rooted in our program quality standards, and what next steps they're hoping to see, and then they can follow up on those next steps, indicate what kind of progress the program is making.
I'd just like to say that I think it's great that the New York City program has monitoring visits that range from weekly to quarterly, as opposed to weekly to none. I did a study some years ago looking at Vermont's differential monitoring system for daycare centers, and they tried for the daycare centers that were performing really well to just sort of dramatically reduce the monitoring and to reallocate those resources to the daycare centers that were not doing well. And it sort of worked. It worked great because the daycare centers that had been doing poorly were now doing better because they're getting more monitoring visits. But it didn't work so well for the centers that had been doing well that really needed at least occasional reminders of what good practices are.
I just want to jump in and channel my teaching and learning colleagues. They would likely not characterize the visits as monitoring. They would say that these are coaching visits, and it actually points to an area, a rich conversation that we're in the process of having of what is coaching, what is monitoring, what is a coach's responsibility to do something that does look more like monitoring.
Yes, my question is also about New York. we're running through them. So my question is also about New York. What is your current per pupil spending? And what was your per pupil spending at the beginning? Has that changed each fiscal year? Is there a difference in the per pupil spending for those students that are in public school sites versus community-based sites? And how are y'all navigating all the what we call in Ohio, I think, layering, maybe you all call braiding, I heard the terminology. How are you navigating all that to make sure that these dollars are the last dollars in, and if there are other dollars that can be used to fund that seat, that those are being used?
So I'll try to give a high-level answer, and then I should probably follow up at the reception. Let me work backwards. Because the Head Start and Child Care Block Grant funding goes to Administration for Children's Services, we're not the best folks equipped to answer about how those funds are rated, and I know that that's maybe what's most relevant to other contexts. Our program is funded by 3 separate state grants and 1 federal grant that passes through the state, and local resources. And we have taken as much of the burden on ourselves centrally as possible, ensuring we make sure that all of our programs meet the requirements of any one of those grants, so that the funding for a particular grant could fund one program or the other, and we would know that those dollars were being spent on a program where the expectations were being met, in an effort to simplify program leaders, any burden on program leaders, principals, so that their funding, the funding from their point of view, is simple. For per pupil, I don't know off the top of my head what our per pupil was prior. It was roughly in line. I mean, the full day program being predominantly in the district schools, our full day rate was roughly in line with where it is now, holding aside factors like collective bargaining and increases in pension. Our program currently is at $863 million, and we pay our district school rate per child, it hovers around $12,000, and our average rate for a contracted program hovers around $10,000. The pre-K centers are a slightly richer model because we fund the administration in those settings. We get to leverage the administrative structure in the district school and so the cost per child in the pre-K centers is a little bit higher, more like $16,000. I can say that our central budget is at or below 10%, and a significant portion of that, depending on how you factor, around half are direct program supports, the social workers, the instructional coordinators, space for professional development, curriculum materials. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for an outstanding afternoon. Each of the panelists was very good, and I really appreciate that. But as I sat here, I got more and more and more frustrated. I realized you all were given a focused discussion, but I wish there had been at least some addressing what happens before 4 years old and 3 years old. I was waiting for somebody. I mean, Wednesday I went to a Crane Center Lunch and Learn where the focus was on how much impact what's going on at 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months has to do with a toddler's social and emotional development. And I'm just afraid that we are looking at preschool education through such blinders, through such a narrow tunnel approach. I think we need to look at the 0 through 3. My children had the benefit of high-quality OSU daycare starting at that time. I think they've now changed it, but at that time it was 3 months. And I think we've got to define preschool more broadly. And then on the other end, the data there suggests what I thought was probably happening when you've got part of your children in daycare or preschool and part of the children not, that what's going on then those first few months, maybe even the whole first year of formalized schooling, is remedial daycare, And I can't imagine how boring that must be for the children who've already acquired some numeracy and literacy skills in a high-quality daycare, and then have to sit through those first few months as the teacher has to get the other children up. I mean, if we're going to do this right, we've got to get all the children up to the point where the teacher can then move from that point on. And then finally, we've still got to address what's going on in those children's, those after going through a high-quality preschool, what's going on in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade. A child, even with a high-quality preschool, simply cannot learn much if she's hungry, if she's coming from a highly abusive home, if she's not sure where she's going to be sleeping that night because the family is either homeless or moving around so much or couch surfing, if the child is hungry, if the child has abscessed teeth, if the child has vision problems, has unmet health care needs, I think we've got to stop looking at it in such a narrow scope and start addressing all these problems. I would love your, this panel is fantastic. I would love to hear your reactions to that.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm sure my colleagues will jump in. Because what you asked many questions there. So let's start with the very, So let's start with the very first one. So one of my increasing concerns is that we are beginning to think of pre-K as a year before school as part of the K-12 system. An alternative way to look at your experiences when you're 4 and 5 is at the end of the 0 to 5 system. And I wish as a country we would take the 0 to 5 area more serious. And I'm worried a little bit with this push toward pre-K that what we'll do is we'll just abandon the 0 to 4s and make pre-K a new grade in school. And I think that's wrong for many reasons. I don't think that'll serve our children well, but I also think it prevents us from looking at what we need to look at, which is that we're one of the very few industrialized countries that doesn't have a coordinated system for caring for our children from birth to 5. In Finland, when you're born, you get a box from the government in which you can sleep as a baby, and it's a welcome to the world. I mean, so there are so many other countries that do so much better by their children and value their children starting when they're born that we don't do. And what worries me about all the attention being paid to pre-K is exactly what you said, is that we don't pay attention anymore to what's going on prior to that. And I'd much rather see I'd rather see it as preschool almost rather than pre-K.
Can I offer something to that? I think my personal bias toward incrementalism is going to show through. But I think one of the things that we're experiencing in New York City is as we're doing the pre-K work, saying, okay, well, now what happens in kindergarten, and should kindergarten also be influenced by what we know about early childhood rather than subsumed in the rest of elementary school, and paying attention to the 0 to 3, to what happens before. There would have been a risk for us in trying, I mean, we did a lot very quickly. There would have been a risk for us in doing too much too quickly and not having been able to establish a success on which to build.
So I'll make a couple comments. Certainly the issues you highlighted are enormously important, and I think all of us up here probably are very concerned about infants and toddlers and their development too. Head Start has been trying to serve more 3-year-olds, so that's definitely a good thing. You do have the Early Head Start program, and that's important. We've seen a dramatic increase in government-funded home visits thanks to the Affordable Care Act. And there are some wonderful programs out there, including the Nurse Family Partnership Program, that have been very well studied and that provide terrific services that have short-term and long-term benefits to disadvantaged kids and to their mothers. I do want to emphasize, while I agree with you, that we do need to pay attention to K through 3. We shouldn't automatically assume that because we're funding those kids that we're serving them well. And I think one one way to sustain the positive effects of high-quality pre-K is by ensuring that kindergarten teachers are changing their pedagogy, that first grade teachers are changing their pedagogy, that second grade teachers are changing their pedagogy to reflect the fact that as more and more kids are arriving at the school door, readier to learn, they should not be receiving redundant instruction. I think some of the problems that Dale may have alluded to in Tennessee and some of the problems that may have afflicted the Oklahoma program in its earliest years could be due potentially to redundant instruction in those early elementary grades. That's something we can fix. It doesn't take a lot of money to fix it, and that's something we should be attentive to.
Hello. Privilege of getting to talk to you earlier this year, and so we've been thinking about the Magic 8 in our community. And I know we kind of asked you this before, but I'm curious if you have any new thoughts about, I know your perspective that class is not the best way to measure the Magic 8, even though when you kind of look at the Magic 8, a lot of those things are really class correlated. But I get that class is just a moment in time versus the extensive all-day monitoring. But is there anything new since we last talked to you that you would suggest we do as an alternative? Because we're still struggling to come up with what is an alternative. I know. Since we can't do the go in the classroom like you would.
No, and I would, so I would never argue that we should export the intensive way we're looking at classrooms, because it would be unreasonable to say that. And what we're hoping is that this intensive look will lead us to something like these Magic 8. Now, the next step, which we're getting into negotiations in 2 weeks with our mayor's office, is to see if we can find some money, and it speaks to your coaching issue, to see if we can find some funds to turn those into, my dream is to turn those into almost apps that a coach could use. So you go in, and what you're looking at just now for this morning's visit or this 2-hour visit is the climate of the classroom. And we're going to give you video snaps of what we mean by behavior disapproving and approving. And we're going to give you things you can look at and even tally while you're there. So that, because I think we need to help our coaches focus on a smaller set of things, sort of one at a time, to get some things under control, rather than the kind of, what I see mostly in coaches, a kind of a general support, almost a morale boost, rather than a focused way of helping people improve their practice. But I agree with you, we need that, and I'm actually talking with Laura, and I got excited about this last night, about the possibility of trying to figure some way to, because she's also interested in something similar, and whether we can't put our heads together and begin to get something out to the field.
Come and try it out.
Okay, thank you.
Can we just expand on that with the other panelists? So as we talk about vision and Columbus trying to, dramatically expand their access to pre-K, and trying to have a plan in place, but it seems like the holy grail is how to measure quality. One, for funders, but two, just in terms of that outcome. So, I've heard, Robin, and you've been talking about class, but what's the future look like in terms of measuring quality? And what you've learned through all of your successes and introduction and ramping up, how would you suggest that we go about trying to measure quality?
Well, I think it's your turn.
Well, okay, so, all right. So this is going to make you really mad. So, no, the gentleman from the school board. No, the way that we addressed it was sort of, when I said that our mission was to close the achievement gap before children enter kindergarten, and of course, a lot of things go into that. But what are the things that we had control over, and what are the things that we might, be able to execute?
And so when we were thinking in terms of quality, we looked at the things that that we as a country have decided are important things. We started with third grade English language arts and math scores, and sort of back mapped and said what kind of experiences would kids in preschool and pre-kindergarten need to have in order to go into kindergarten on par with their more advantaged peers to be likely to do very well on those third grade scores. And it's not that I think we should narrow the curriculum, but I mean, when you look at our K through 12 system, where we are, I mean, only about 30% of kids are advanced or proficient on those basic competencies that we've decided are important. So when you look at all of the things that we should do, all of the things that we could do, and I'm very sympathetic to all of those, we just kind of started with those things that we might be able to influence through the funding and the program characteristics that we have. I think if we could have some success in those areas and then be open-minded and flexible enough so that we're not locking programs and delivery systems in place so that they couldn't do more or they couldn't graft other things on easily, I think it's a good start. But I mean, the thing that I think is always hard in these discussions is whenever you're talking about preschool and pre-kindergarten, it always goes to what about birth to 3, and then it's sort of like, yeah, I know, but we don't really have a lever for that right now when we're sitting around talking about how do you even fund preschool and pre-kindergarten. So I think it's important to keep talking about these issues. It's important to find places where we can get little victories and we can sort of make some part of this a lot better and sustainable and continue to recognize that there's a lot more that we have to do after that.
I don't know if how many of you know about Jim Hunt's Smart Start initiative, which took place when I was in actually North Carolina, and I remember it vividly. So Hunt, as the governor, made money available to come to counties, not school districts, but counties, if they got together every person, every agency in their county that worked with young children 0 to 5. And it was so low tech. They actually sent out a picture of a table with chairs that were empty around the table, and each county had to fill in, like health department, social work, they had to fill in everybody who came to the meeting, and they had to come together to make a plan for their county for how they were going to work 0 to 5. And yes, so some money in most counties was allocated toward 4-year-old programs, but there was a lot of coordination that took place at the county level. And I'm beginning to think we only can do this at the local level. Well, it hasn't worked to try to do it broader, but he did make money available to that county to get that enterprise going, and that's the only place I've known that to happen, and it was very successful.
So we are asking ourselves that same question. I think we feel excited and comfortable with where we're at right now in terms of the data points that we're using, but recognize that we have a lot of work to do. And we have found many interesting ways to use our Eckers and class data and find it to be very rich, but know that it doesn't paint the full picture. And that we need to use those data points, among others, to make decisions about how to support programs and how to hold programs accountable. One question that I am asking that is along the same lines as what you've just asked, I think, is that we have 16 program quality standards that we've defined, and right now we are only measuring like 3 of them. And those are 3 of the most important, if I had to rank them. But in thinking about our program assessment strategy over the next 5 years, I am wondering whether we should try to go broad and figure out ways to measure more program quality standards, or to go deep and triple down on measuring the standards that are related to instruction and family engagement and learning environment and all of those things that we're already looking at. I will say that personally, I am really interested in looking at or developing or finding or co-developing a tool that assesses leadership practices. I think that that is an incredible lever that we don't pay attention to. And I mean, we know in the K-12 system that is extremely important. And I don't, in our system, we don't talk about that much for pre-K.
I'm cognizant of the fact that it is just a few minutes before 5 o'clock. And there were so many questions. We were going to sort of put you all on the spot with a couple closing questions. But does anybody, any of our panelists who traveled so far, you have such great knowledge, is there any closing remark you'd care to make? Round out the day? Put you all on the spot. I will make the closing remarks then. I want to thank you all. This would not have been fun if I was here by myself. But I really appreciate you coming out and showing that in Columbus, there's this many people who care so much about this topic and are committed to learning more and pushing and thinking and being a community. Every talk, there was a implicit point being made that this doesn't happen without a lot of people working together. So I thank our panelists for coming. I thank Tanny Crane for being here all afternoon and being a great thought partner in what today should look like. And we'll see you next year. You'll receive a white paper that summarizes the day and some of the recommendations that were made. And I would personally like to invite all of you to head right downstairs to celebrate this beautiful weather with a cocktail and some snacks. So thank you for coming.